First of four almost forgotten illustrators featured in this video is the man Norman Rockwell called his idol, and it's easy to see why. Like Rockwell, Joseph Christian Leyendecker was a household name in his lifetime, but unlike Rockwell, his remarkable and influential body of work is now largely ignored. Leyendecker was born in Germany, but the family emigrated to Chicago in 1882 when he was 6. So pronounced was his talent, he took on his first commission for 60 biblical illustrations when he was only 18. And following a couple of years studying art in Chicago and Paris, he won a competition to design a cover for Century magazine with this heavily Mooka-influenced image. In his early 20s, Leyendecker set up a studio in New York, and almost immediately he was commissioned to produce the first of what was to be over 300 cover illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post. And this soon attracted other clients from the world of publishing. His work started getting noticed by advertisers, and before long he had established particularly lucrative long-term relationships with a range of wealthy clients, particularly in men's clothing. And from 1910 onwards, he created a series of 20 Kellogg's Kids for the cereal brand's long-running ad campaign. In 1914, having made a colossal amount of money from his prestigious commissions, Leyendecker moved into a grand mansion in New Rochelle, New York, complete with a full staff of servants. During the First World War, Leyendecker was already too old to fight, but painted posters for the war effort and patriotic cover art for the Post and other magazines. Although he was capable of remarkable results using gouache, as in this example, Leyendecker's preferred medium was oil paint. And if you examine many of his paintings at close quarters, you can see what gave his work its distinctive clarity. There are quite deliberate bold brush strokes of tonal variation which give all surfaces a slightly chiselled effect. And unlike many others at this time, Leyendecker despised the use of photography in painting, viewing it as an admission of weakness. And he was so steeped in traditional methods, he would laboriously make several studies of his subject before committing to the final image. Throughout the 1920s, Joseph Leyendecker was at the height of his career and fame, and continued to live a luxurious, hedonistic lifestyle, paid for by his clients who seemed totally committed to his illustrative style. But this was not to last. In many ways he had been too successful, and the 1930s marked the beginning of his decline, when his generous client base started to desert him. He was beginning to be considered yesterday's big thing, and they started to want something and someone else, so their ads could be more distinctive. And following the Wall Street crash of 1929, few could afford the outlandish fees he had come to expect. And perhaps most importantly, there was a change of editor at the Post, and the new guy was not a fan of Leyendecker's work, so that source of income started to dry up too. And his career never recovered, so ultimately he had to let the household staff go, leaving his formerly grand estate largely neglected. He became increasingly withdrawn and difficult to deal with. This was Leyendecker's last cover for the Saturday Evening Post in 1943. And although occasional commissions for magazine and even advertising work continued to come his way, his best years were definitely behind him. And if you hadn't heard of Joseph Leyendecker, you certainly won't know about his little brother Frank. Franz Xavier Leyendecker was also extremely talented, and with some help from his brother, he too was pretty successful at what he did. Like Joseph, Frank was staunchly representational and worked in oils, and sometimes only the signature revealed which Leyendecker was which. But as time went on, he made greater use of softer progressive tone in his brushwork, and both his favourite light-hearted subjects and style echoed that of the romantic 18th century French painters such as Fragonard, far more than the sculpted look of Joseph's technique. But predictably, Frank always felt he was doomed to stay in the shadow of an older brother who was more talented, more successful, more famous, and more popular. Whether this insecurity and resentment is what drove him to become an alcoholic morphine addict isn't known, but it's not a bad guess. Joseph had taken him under his wing from the outset of his own career and got Frank introductions to all the right people and allowed him to share in his glamorous lifestyle and his wealthy clients. Frank even lived and worked at Joseph's New Rochelle mansion. Frank did, however, have his own clients in the worlds of publishing and advertising, and Life magazine in particular gave him a large number of commissions for cover art, which encouraged his playful fantasy imagery. But over the years, Frank's addictions got worse. Things deteriorated between the two brothers, ending in physical fights. This cover for Life magazine is the last image Frank had published before his death from an overdose of morphine at the age of 48. If you want to find out more about Frank's work, be warned. An online search actually brings up more by his older brother than it does by Frank. Even in death, he is still in Joseph's shadow. Clarence Lawson Wood didn't much care for the name Clarence, so he simply didn't use it, either professionally or personally. He was a quintessentially British humorous illustrator, possessed of an exceptional comic imagination, narrative dexterity, and a painterly skill that many more serious artists would envy. In his lifetime, Lawson Wood was best known for three specific themes: cavemen and dinosaurs, portly comical policemen, and animals, especially monkeys and apes. But these weren't his only subjects. In reality, they were just his most popular. At the age of 18, he got a job as a staff illustrator for magazine publisher C. Arthur Pearson. He soon became creatively frustrated by this, and a few years later embarked on a more rewarding freelance career. Even though he served heroically in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, he simultaneously produced a series of comic postcards with military themes. Interestingly, his more serious illustration work from the same time was remarkably undistinguished by comparison. After the war, Lawson Wood enjoyed great success and found many outlets for his cheerful pictures. In addition to the postcards, he was frequently published in magazines and children's books, and occasionally used in advertising campaigns. And many of his images were reproduced as prints simply for the good cheer and visual humour they represented. Lawson Wood's Cavemen series was effectively the conceptual prototype for the Flintstones. In his prehistoric world, dinosaurs and men live side by side, although not amicably, and there are anachronistic Stone Age versions of modern devices such as vehicles. But popular as they were, this series was overshadowed by his police-themed images. These remarkably well-composed and painted gouache pictures really do evoke the funny side of British life. But as with all of Lawson Wood's work, it is their narrative strength which is their most enduring and endearing feature, and he invites you to deduce how we got to the situation and what's going to happen next. And last we come to the third and easily most successful of his abiding themes, monkeys and apes. His affection for animals was quite genuine, and to his credit he even set up his own animal sanctuary as well as working for other animal charities. And it's that genuine affection which makes these pictures so engaging. The star of his series was Grandpop, the elderly orangutan, and the books Lawson Wood created featuring this character brought him fame around the world. This led to a long run successfully producing cover art for the American magazine Collier's. And his work was even used for advertising posters in the USA and Europe at a time when international success was rare. Grandpop in particular was heavily merchandised into other products such as jigsaws and even toys. The The toys sold well even though they weren't constructed with anything like the same attention to detail and anatomy that was evident in his drawing. And at the height of his popularity in the late 1940s, Lawson Wood retired not only from illustration, but the rest of society, and lived as a recluse until his death in 1957. In addition to being a significantly distinctive cartoon illustrator, Brazilian José Carlos was also a successful designer, sculptor, publisher, playwright, and even song lyricist. He was born in Rio de Janeiro and lived and worked there all his life, which undoubtedly explains why any memory of such an unusually talented creative man seems to be almost completely buried. His earliest cartoon work appeared in 1902 for Tagarela magazine. He was just 18 and with no formal training, it's very much the work of a beginner. But he continued to submit and improve, and within a few years had graduated to cover art. In 1910 he started working for Careta magazine, and by now glimpses of the consummate stylist he would become can be seen alongside the clumsier aspects of his drawing. But as the 20s approached, his style in both black and white and colour rapidly developed into something altogether more communicative and confident. It would appear that Carlos and Art Deco were made for each other. At this stage, José Carlos worked pretty much exclusively for magazines, and although his working relationship with Careta continued throughout the 20s, in 1922 he became the editor of Para Todos, which soon became his primary concern. And as well as editing, he commissioned himself to produce an apparently never-ending stream of stylish comic and occasionally erotic Art Deco covers for the next 8 years. These images are hugely successful for several reasons. Firstly, the precision and expressiveness of the shapes he created to inform his figure work. And secondly, the relentlessly creative response to a limited, usually 2 or 3 colour palette, which on many occasions predicted the psychedelic posters of the 60s. And lastly, whether riotously complex or daringly simple, they were always imaginatively composed and constructed. Carlos used the identical approach for his cover art for O Malo, but when working for Fonfon magazine, he adopted a far softer, more painterly style, possibly because the bigger budgets enabled full colour printing. And the same was true of his illustrations for O Cruzeiro, to the extent that some of the colours are barely recognisable as his work. In addition to all this magazine work, José Carlos found time to create comic pages and covers for the children's weekly Tico Tico. And he brought his agreeably skewed humour to his children's bookwork, which even at its most instructional was playfully imaginative and aesthetically pleasing. In 1941, during a visit to Rio, Walt Disney invited Carlos to work for him in Hollywood. But Carlos turned him down and carried on churning out his exuberant, absurdist art, mostly for his longest-standing client, Careta, in the place of his birth, life, and untimely death from heart failure in 1950.